Chapter 1. She was born on the ferry over the river Styx as her parents fled the underworld. Her father passed her into the arms of her exhausted mother. Then the new parents leaned their foreheads against each other's in a moment of unparalleled relief. They had escaped the realm past death, and brought forth new life. On the other end of the boat, the ferryman ceased the long strokes of his pole and held out his palm. "She wasn't yet born when we paid," the mother protested, cradling the girl to herself. The ferryman looked at her with dark eyes, unmoved. "We have nothing left," the father said, anguished. And so a man and a woman boarded the ferry from the underworld, and a man and a woman disembarked on the other side of the river. Sharon stood in his boat and watched them make their way from the reedy banks to the caverns that would lead them to the sunlit lands. In his arms he held a baby, her mouth still golden with her first milk. He named her Myrrine. Hermes, the messenger god who led the dead to the ferryman, was enjoined to also bring milk for the girl. The waters of the Styx rocked her to sleep, while in her waking hours, she played with the silver drachmas Sharon collected as fare. He was a taciturn man, and she learned to speak from the newly dead who rode the ferry to the underworld. Whether the passengers' lives had been grand or unremarkable, she listened intently to their stories. Sharon indulged her. If a tale needed more time for telling, he would slow the ferry. Her only playmate was Bion, the young son of the rulers of the underworld. With such lineage he was allowed to clamber aboard the boat without any payment, especially as he always returned to the shore he came from. He and Myrrine dreamed of their futures as Sharon pushed the ferry down the river. "When I rule the underworld. When I row the ferry. As they grew older, there was a brief period when they traded ambitions, but after meeting Persephone, Myrrine decided that being the queen of the underworld wouldn't suit her after all. Bion grew disillusioned with becoming a ferryman when he discovered Sharon never spent any of his coins. "How would you, in the underworld?" Myrrine asked. Bion propped up his chin in one hand and scratched at the beginning bristles of his beard. "Maybe that's it. We should leave the underworld." Charon's steady strokes faltered for a moment. Myrrine glanced at her father, but he was gazing out over the Styx. She turned back to Bion. "I thought you couldn't leave." His mouth twisted. "My mother promised my father not to take me out of here. I never swore the same." She pressed her hand to his in sympathy. She'd never known a mother, and rather preferred it to the stormy dramatics between Bion's parents. "You're of age now. He can't keep you here much longer." His face lightened at the thought and he gave her a grateful smile. "We could go together. Don't you want to see the land of the living?" "I'm curious," she admitted. Stories, no matter how plentiful and varied, could never be as rich as actual experience. They stared at the distant shore. Sharon cleared his throat but didn't speak. He didn't need to. If the lord of the underworld didn't want his son to leave his realm, the ferryman wasn't going to cross his will. They didn't get a chance to speak of it again. War came to batter Greece and keep Sharon busy, and Myrrine with him. There was barely any lull between passengers, most of them soldiers who'd fallen in battle. From them she heard about the Persian invaders, how their warriors wore turbans and rode fleet horses, and how far they encroached into Greek lands. But as much as these stories fascinated her, she missed Bion and his easy conversation. She hadn't had a chance to see him for weeks, and it felt strange to have gone so long without talking to him. His mother might have already left the underworld, as she did with the turning of the seasons every year, and that was always a difficult time for him. "Can we wait for Bion?" she asked her father after he delivered the latest boatload. The number of passengers had begun to dwindle. Sharon shook his head, already pushing off to return to the other shore. There must be more dead awaiting a ride to the underworld. A single man stood on the riverbank. The bronze breastplate over his red tunic marked him as a soldier, while his grim mouth and heavy brow told of recent defeat. He would no doubt tell another tale of a tragic yet glorious battle. She hoped it was one which she hadn't heard yet. Her father let the boat push through the reeds to bump into land, and held out his hand. Myrrine alighted, looking around for Hermes. The messenger god occasionally lingered to greet her after leading the recently passed here, but he had already sped off. He had left a gift, though. A small amphora sat on the ground next to the soldier, and she started toward it, wondering what it held. The man fumbled at his belt and she shot him a curious glance. Most passengers already had their coin ready before her father even touched ashore. Often it was tucked under their tongues, if a loved one had seen to their final rest. Then the man yanked her against him and pinned her there with a broad arm across her chest. She squeaked indignantly. Did this man think whores awaited him in the underworld? Her father lifted his pole as though to hurl it like a javelin. "How about a different bargain?" The soldier said coolly. "I'll spare her life in return for passage." A cold blade touched her throat. She stopped struggling, not even daring to swallow for fear of cutting herself. "Steady, girl. I promise I'll return you to your father unharmed," he said directly into her ear, his breath hot and unpleasant on her skin. He raised his voice so Sharon could hear. "First, you'll need to do me a favor." Sharon lowered his pole and cast the man a dark look, but nodded. The soldier nudged Myrrine. "Pick up the amphora." She obeyed, and when she straightened, he took it from her and herded her toward the boat. They boarded in slow, synchronous movements to avoid jostling the knife. "Once they were in," he said, "take me across." Sharon pushed the boat into the river and began to pull them to the other side. Myrrine bit down on her rage until her jaw ached. How dared this man command her father like this? When the knife eased away a fingerspan, she demanded, "You're not even dead, are you?" He stank of sweat and desperation, he reeked of life. His hold on her tightened briefly, as if she'd startled him by speaking. Was he expecting a demure maiden? No. I wouldn't need to force my way aboard otherwise. Who else would want to go to the underworld? He chuckled. I plan to be heading back across the Styx soon enough. And with company, besides you. He wasn't the first person to have thought of bringing the dead out of the underworld. Her mother had done it with her birth father, after all. But Sharon rarely yielded to petition or threat, and had only ever allowed a handful of living men aboard his boat, all before she was born. She hadn't realized how vulnerable he'd become by adopting her. And this man dared to use her against her father. She bared her teeth. "Whoever you are, you won't steal the dead so easily. I am Aristodemos, son of Cleitos, of Sparta, and I have nothing to lose." She didn't recognize the name, as he seemed to expect. Oddly, that seemed to make him relax a little. "What should I call you, girl?" There was no reason not to tell him, especially if it would keep him from calling her girl. Myrrine. The exchange gave the conversation a strangely civil air, despite the blade at her neck. Many of the dead never bothered to ask for her name. She, on the other hand, was in the habit of always finding out the passenger's life story. And perhaps if she knew his purpose, she could foil him. "Who are you trying to bring out?" she asked. "Old comrades in arms." She frowned. She'd expected a torrid tale of a romance cut too short, or perhaps a son who had been taken by the war. Most soldiers are proud to die in battle. Are you sure they want to be returned to life? Evidently she'd touched a nerve. The knife kissed her skin and he said in a raw voice, "They deserve to live more than I do." Her father was sending her urgent glances, signaling for her to keep her mouth closed and avoid antagonizing this man. She subsided, but her curiosity was piqued more than ever. The rest of the ride passed in silence. When Sharon brought the boat to the far shore, he did so with special care not to rock it over much. He'd been less gentle for queens and heroes. Aristodemos prodded her off the ferry, then paused to address Sharon. "We'll be back shortly. I'll keep her safe as long as you raise no hand or outcry against me. If you do, it wouldn't be far for her to go." Sharon didn't move, but she wouldn't have stood willingly under his baleful glare. Once they'd gone a short distance into the bleak gray plains of underworld, Aristodemos came to a halt. Pale shades wandered around them, careless of their presence. "Here," he said. "Open this." With his free hand, he held out the amphora. Myrrine took hold of the stopper and yanked it out so violently the contents splashed over her hand and onto the ground, rich and crimson. Even before it marked her skin, she knew what it was from its metallic smell: blood. He sucked in his breath. "Careful with that. I sacrificed a kingly ram and a prime for it." She flicked droplets off her fingertips, intrigued. "Why do you need sheep's blood?" "I consulted an oracle. The dead won't speak with me unless they drink it first." The amount she'd spilled certainly seemed to be attracting attention. She was used to the dead, but once they crossed over the Styx they were usually an apathetic lot, or given over to despondence if they'd been sentenced to some punishment for their deeds in life. The shades clustering around them wore slack looks of mindless hunger. She suppressed a shiver. Aristodemos kept pivoting to prevent the shades from reaching the amphora. He shouted, "Dionysus, son of Tychon." The dead folk shuffled about, and a broken-nosed man stepped forward, something stirring in his gaze as his name was called again. He approached, and Aristodemos let him clutch the neck of the amphora, then tipped it so he could drink. The knife never wavered from Myrrine's throat. The shade swallowed convulsively until Aristodemos pulled the amphora away. The blood had made him more substantial, his face seemed more mobile now, capable of expression beyond hollow despair. And indeed, glad recognition warred with sorrow when he looked up. "Aristodemos. Your time came already?" Dionysus's eyes narrowed as he took in the tableau. "What's this?" The blade at her throat pressed closer in warning before she could say anything. "It's your time to leave that's come," Aristodemos said. "Leave? Sparta has need of you. The Persians are still pressing in on us, worse than before." Dionysus scowled and folded his arms. "I'd help fight them if I could. But what can I do, here in the underworld?" "Exactly," Aristodemos said. Dionysus's face lightened as understanding dawned. "You sly bastard. How many of us can you take?" "All of you. But help me with this girl first, she's our way out of here. I have some rope strapped to my armor. Bind her hands together, then her ankles." She opened her mouth to object, but metal pricked her skin and she subsided, letting Dionysus tie her up. He was brisk about it but not unkind, making sure the rope wasn't too constricting and leaving a short length of slack between her ankles so she could walk but not run. Aristodemos gagged her as well, foiling any attempt to attract the attention of Bion or even Hades. Once he was satisfied she wouldn't escape, Aristodemos turned to Dionysus and caught him in a kiss. "It's good to see you again, more than you can know." They stood there quietly for a moment with their foreheads touching, gazes locked. Then Aristodemos broke into a grin. "Now let's gather our comrades." Dionysus cocked his head. "What of King Leonidas?" A muscle twitched in Aristodemos's jaw. "Let him rest quietly in Elysium." "Are you still angry with him?" "He sent you away because, ... He sent me away, and I lived, and the rest of you all died." She almost didn't recognize Aristodemos like this, stripped of all bluster, grim-eyed, hollow-voiced. The Persians advanced. "It never should have happened that way. So I'm bringing you back. Are you going to help me?" The worry crease didn't leave Dionysus's brow, but he nodded. "I'll help." But before they could turn to their task, a low growl interrupted them. They froze as a large, three-headed dog prowled closer to them, Cerberus, who kept the dead from escaping and the living from entering. Saliva dripped from his jaws. Dionysus looked to Aristodemos. "Did you happen to plan for this?" Cerberus advanced with fangs bared, then lifted one of his noses to sniff the air and whined. Another head turned toward Myrrine. He sat back on his haunches with his tail drooping. Her presence must be confusing him. Bion had trained him never to threaten her. The beast must think she was with these men, instead of their captive, and that her status extended to them. Aristodemos took advantage of Cerberus's hesitation to unstrap a bag and bring out a bloody hunk of meat, which he tossed to the dog. All three heads snapped and tore at it, snarling among themselves. "Fresh slaughtered sheep," he explained to Dionysus. "Dosed. With poison?" Myrrine watched anxiously as Cerberus wolfed down the mutton. He rarely had a chance to eat fresh meat, and if he smelled anything unusual in this gift, he overlooked it in favor of satisfying his hunger. She wasn't all that fond of the creature, but both Hades and Bion seemed to hold some affection for him. After he licked his chops clean, he yawned widely and rested one of his heads upon his paws. The other heads lowered as well, eyes closing. One snored. Aristodemos must have used a sleeping draught. She gave the drowsing beast a dark look. The fearsome guardian of the underworld shouldn't be so easily vanquished. Without Cerberus to interfere, the two men sorted through the shades until they found fellow soldiers who died in the same battle, and offered them sips of the sheep's blood. All of them agreed to Aristodemos's plan. Myrrine expected it was too much for a soldier not to want more glory and a second chance at the enemy who'd felled him. When they headed back to the sticks, Charon was still waiting there. As far as she could tell, he hadn't moved at all, except for the sharp gaze that tracked every movement of Aristodemos's. Her captor had resumed his position behind her with his knife bared. Again they stepped onto the ferry, but this time they were accompanied by as many men as could fit. The remainder, hundreds of them, it seemed, were instructed to wait their turn. Charon's mouth twisted, but he set his pole into the river and took them to the other side. The soldiers sent up a glad cry as they stepped ashore. Aristodemos cursed them and clutched her to him tightly. "Don't leap about like grasshoppers. Keep the boat steady." She was relieved to reach land without mishap. But she knew better than to expect that she would be released now. When Charon reached his hand out toward Aristodemos, for once demanding not a coin, but the blade pressed closer to her neck. "There are more," Aristodemos said. "Go get them all." After a long moment, her father dropped his arm and took up his pole again, pushing the ferry back into the river current. It took many trips to ferry the rest of the men across. Aristodemos counted them by marking neat rows of tallies in the ground with a stick. While he was busy greeting the men from the last boatload, she surreptitiously rubbed out one mark with her heel. Just one. Let Aristodemos drive himself mad wondering where the last man was, a small revenge for how he'd threatened her father, but all she could manage. But to her surprise, he came back to the patch of ground and finished drawing an even 300 tallies. He rose with an exultant grin. Her eyes narrowed. That meant 301 men had been brought out of the underworld, 300 of Aristodemos's fellow soldiers and one impostor. Perhaps that would be enough to wreak havoc on Aristodemos's purposes once he was gone from here. His mission completed, he threw a purse at Karen's feet. It clinked with the weight of many coins. Take this for the cost of passage. Her father shook his head and pointed to Myrrine. She presented her bound wrists to Aristodemos for him to remove. But instead of freeing her, he grabbed hold of her elbow and pulled her away from the river, toward the caverns that led toward the sunlit realms. Sharon cried out hoarsely. The sound of her father's distress was too much for her. She pulled away from Aristodemos so abruptly that she won free of his grip, but with her full weight leaning away from him and her ankles still tied, she overbalanced and fell. The impact made her bite her lip, and when he pulled her up and saw the blood dotting her gag, he pulled it off with an oath. She spat at him. Lying scum. You said you'd return me to my father. That's what I'm doing. Are you all right? Sharon is my father. No, Sharon is the man who stole you from your real parents. She knew the story. They abandoned me. But a trickle of curiosity wended its way into her. What did this man know of her history? He gave her a pitying look. Is that what he told you? He forced them to leave you here. And they were so very worried about it for the next 20 years, I can tell. He blew out his breath. It isn't easy to find a hero who'll brave this place. I only agreed to rescue you in return for what they could tell me about the underworld. She glared at him. Give me your knife and you can find out all about it. That only elicited an infuriating chuckle. Let me go, she said. You might have struck a deal, but what honor is there in abducting me? In her ears she could still hear Sharon calling out for her as Aristodemos dragged her away. Don't you want to meet your parents? Learn what name they would have given you if only they'd been able to keep you? She fumed, but silently. Because she did want to know, the way she wanted to know everything, all the rich details of every person's life. And it would be a chance to see the sunlit lands. But it's a bit of a journey to their home. Before I take you to them. She sighed. We're going somewhere else first so you can fight the Persians? Ah. Yes. He scratched the side of his nose. You'll stay back when we fight. You won't be in much danger. Didn't the Persians kill everyone in whatever battle these men died in? His expression darkened into a scowl. Keep questioning me, girl, and the Persians will be the least of your worries. He pulled her none too gently in the direction of the cave that would take them above ground. She couldn't account for his sudden air of menace. For all that he'd threatened her earlier, she'd understood that was to coerce her father. This burst of anger felt more personal. She wasn't sure she could trust such an unstable man to keep her safe, whatever his promises to her birth parents. She cast a glance over her shoulder, wishing she could tell her father where she was going. Sharon would never leave the ferry. But when she caught a glimpse of him standing upon his boat in the distance, he looked surprisingly composed. She knew he cared about her. He wouldn't have defied Hades's mandate and allowed 300 men to leave the realm of the dead otherwise, so how could he be so calm? But maybe he thinks I can get myself out of this mess. That was a heartening thought. Many of the women who had crossed the Styx on his boat had been sheltered, delicate creatures. He hadn't raised her to be like them. And there were tales of Amazons and clever wives who'd made their own way out of danger. For once she could lead her own adventure instead of merely listening to someone else's. But what would Bayan think when he found her gone? They were supposed to leave the underworld together. The soldiers set up a march, even raising their voices in song. Myrrine found herself envying their vigor. Once dead they might be, but she'd spent most of her life in a boat, and their stamina outmatched hers. She trudged onward, losing track of time and distance in these dark tunnels. The air changed, bearing the hint of tantalizingly unfamiliar smells, something fresh and almost sweet. Something living. The cavern was brighter here, she could make out the shadows and angles of the rough-hewn walls. Dionysus began moving more sluggishly, then stopped altogether. I can't go any farther. Aristodemos turned, frowning. We're almost there. The wind's too strong. There was no wind, Myrrine's hair wasn't even stirred by the faint air currents. But the faint draft that had carried the new scents was a real obstacle for the dead. They were all leaning forward as though into a fierce gale, struggling to take their next step. They didn't have enough substance to make their way into the land of the living. Dionysus leaned against the cavern wall, exhausted by his efforts. We may need to beg for Hades's permission after all. We're still but shades. Aristodemos said slowly. If a ram's blood brought you this far, he folded his hand over the blade of his knife. When he opened it, blood ran bright from the gash in his palm. Drink, my friend. Dionyx took hold of his wrist and bent to lap at the blood. Myrrine felt her gorge rising. This was too close to human sacrifice for her taste. But either the rationality gained earlier from the sheep's blood or his regard for Aristodemos kept Dionyx from ravaging the flesh like a beast. After a moment, he straightened and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Even that simple motion looked crisper than all his movements before. How do you feel? Aristodemos asked. Dionyx grinned. I could climb Mount Olympus. He strode forward and rounded the turn out of sight. His voice came to them, exultant. Sunlight, by the gods. Greetings, Helios. The other soldiers clustered around Aristodemos eagerly, taking turns sipping his blood. He had to reopen his wounds several times and urged the men to take only the smallest amount they needed, but even so it took a long while for even half of them to drink. When the time came for yet another cut, Aristodemos fell back, covering his hand. Even in the dim light she could tell he was pale. There are too many of you. His eye fell on Myrrine. She whirled to run, but with her ankles hobbled he caught her easily. She fought, but only managed to rub her skin raw where the ropes bound her. He stretched out her arms while someone else held her still and nicked one of her veins. The only kindness he allowed her was to gather the blood into his waterskin so the soldiers wouldn't need to press their mouths against her flesh. As she watched the blood flow from her, the world seemed to slide away, and she fell into darkness. Chapter 2. Bayan's mother was just about to leave to spend the rest of the year in the sunlit realms, and his father's mood was predictably doleful. Bayan had never understood their relationship. They maintained a chilly silence when together, yet their parting was always preceded by a storm of recriminations on both sides. They unfailingly followed the same pattern, like two wary beasts circling each other endlessly. Hades, diffident, as though everyone in the sunlit lands and the underworld alike didn't know of his love for her. You don't have to go. A disdainful glance accompanied her acid response. And why would I stay here? To be with you? Then his rising anger. How can I make things better if you're never here? And her finishing blow. Feed me more seeds, then. You could keep me here the entire year. There was never anything Hades could say to that. It was the unforgivable act that would always come between them. Bayan watched them fight because the last thing his mother always did before departing was to give him a kiss, and he wanted to be there to receive it before she left. When he was younger, that small gesture had been all that kept him from believing she left the underworld to get away from him. She came to him now and pressed her lips to his cheek. I'll be back when the seasons turn, she murmured, as was her habitual reassurance. He breathed in her scent. She always smelled faintly of flowers. Farewell, mother. She began to draw away, then paused. I might have a surprise for you. He blinked and she was gone. That wasn't usual at all. The only surprise he normally got from her returns was the fact that she came back at all. Sometimes I wish I'd never married her, Hades muttered. Bayan bit his tongue. But then we wouldn't have you. The rigid set of his father's shoulders relaxed a little. One of the reasons she wanted to go this time was to find a suitable bride for you. Bayan took a step back. A bride? To marry? What else would you do with her? Hades shook his head in exasperation. You're a grown man now, and it's past time for you to have a wife. And bring her here? That worked so well for you. He instantly regretted his sarcastic tone. Hades' mouth tightened, but he'd exhausted his anger on Persephone. The two of you could live where you pleased. You haven't given me that choice so far, Bayan pointed out. The farthest he was allowed to go was Elysium, and only to learn from the greatest dead warriors. It's an unsettled time up there. And you haven't come into your powers yet. This was a sore topic. Some gods were born with divine abilities, but Bayan had reached adulthood without any sign of his. As the full-blooded child of two gods, he was immortal, but he was as helpless as a mortal otherwise. He couldn't blame his father's caution. But he still chafed at it. But once I'm married, I'm free to go where I wish? He knew a very short list of eligible women. What about Myrrine? The ferryman's girl? Hades had never approved of Myrrine, for whom Sharon had allowed her parents to escape the underworld. I think you can do better than that. At least we wouldn't fight all the time, but... Hades' nostrils flared. Bayan backed away. I'll leave you be now. He hadn't meant his words as a taunt, he'd been serious about Myrrine. And the more he thought about it, the better the idea seemed. They were already good friends, and she wouldn't quail at the thought of living in the underworld. She was of marriageable age, and Sharon didn't have much of a chance to look for suitors. Perhaps he'd go see her. He was past due a visit to her, and she'd have a few wry words that would set his mood to rights. It was a good time to be scarce in the palace in any case. The underworld seemed to reflect its lord's disposition, the fields an expanse of brooding grey and the dry stalks of grass snapping underfoot. Myrrine would be the exception. Her eyes, though still grey, were lively and full of warmth, and her smile was always genuine, as brightening to his spirits as sunlight would have been in this realm. He suspected it was because she was the only living being who'd never known any home but the underworld. One year, his mother had taken him with her to meet his grandmother. It had been the cruelest thing she'd ever done. When his father found out, he'd raged about how he would not lose his son along with his wife and had forbidden Persephone to take Bion out of the underworld again. Now Bion could only dream of the glory of mountains against a sky of melting colors and the offhand calls of crickets and birds reminding him of the abundance of life. He'd sat on the banks of the Lethe once, wondering if he should drink from the river of forgetfulness and lose those memories. Instead he kept them folded inside himself. He'd told only Myrrine about them. He headed for the Styx, hoping she, or rather, Sharon, would be free. A war raged in Greece above, and each of the last several times he'd gone to the river, the ferryman had been busy conveying slain soldiers across the river. He wondered how the war went. Myrrine could tell him how things fared in the land of the living. She always knew the latest news, gleaned from her father's passengers. The underworld seemed too quiet. It took him a moment to pinpoint the reason. Usually by now Cerberus had bounded up to him, eager for a scratch under each jaw. A little ways farther, he came across the dog's body, slumped on the ground. He dropped to his knees by its side in alarm. To his relief, Cerberus was only asleep. All three heads were waffling at dreams. He tried to chivvy one awake without success. This was no natural slumber. He proceeded warily, and his pace slowed even further as he approached the shore where he usually met Charon's boat. A group of men stood there, their military bearing betraying them as soldiers. They were talking and gesticulating with an excitement he almost never saw in the dead, and they didn't even notice as he came closer. He tried the forthright approach. "Why are you waiting here?" Without even glancing at him, one of the men said, "Aristodemos has to send the boat over." Bion smothered an incredulous laugh. Sharon almost never allowed anyone to leave his father's realm, as this band of soldiers would discover soon enough. He played along for now. "What about the ferryman?" Someone else offered. I think Aristodemos grabbed hold of the ferryman's daughter. His vision seemed to narrow until he could see nothing but the column of the speaker's neck. It would be such a simple act to throttle the breath out of it. He unclenched his fingers at his sides and fought to keep an even voice. "What's he going to do with her?" "Depends how pretty she is," another man joked, and Bion took a step toward him, trying to decide between torturous fates. Another said in thoughtful tones, "The ferryman must have a fortune in drachmas by now. Maybe we could ransom her." "Don't anger him needlessly," one of the older soldiers advised. "We'll all have to cross this river again someday." That quieted them and gave Bion a chance to recover his temper and think through what he could do to find out more about Myrrine's situation. He couldn't strangle them all individually. There were too many of them, and although the shades couldn't truly hurt him, he didn't want to lose his chance to help Myrrine. So he joined their ranks. It was almost disappointingly easy. They didn't pay him much attention as he insinuated himself into the last boatload across the Styx. Sharon noticed him well enough. His eyes widened and Bion tensed against a protest, but the ferryman didn't acknowledge his presence until Bion managed to maneuver his way into the spot next to him. Then Sharon spoke but a single soft yet urgent word, "Myrrine." His gaze flickered to the far shore. Bion kept his own voice low. "Should we attack them when we land?" Sharon gave him an exasperated look. Clearly he wasn't going to leave his boat. "And I'm not supposed to leave the underworld." Bion lifted a brow, inviting the ferryman into fellow truancy. Sharon only shook his head in a clear warning against foolishness. Bion took in the situation as they came ashore with a sinking heart. At least a couple hundred men had already crossed over, and they all looked to be trained soldiers. One of them, brawnier than the rest, stood behind Myrrine and held a sword to her throat. Bion tensed with the effort not to rush forward with a battle cry. He would have tried to signal some sort of reassurance to her except she looked furious rather than frightened, and she didn't even glance his way. He stepped onto land. His breath hitched, but his father didn't come roaring for him to return. Hades must still be wallowing about his mother's departure. The men around him were cheering and slapping each other on their backs in congratulations. He joined in the celebration, mostly so as not to stand out, but a little for himself and his unexpected freedom. A friendly hand clasped his shoulder. "Glad to be out?" Bion turned and grinned. He didn't have to force the expression at all. Overjoyed. The soldier's grasp grew firmer as he held Bayan still to examine his face. I don't remember you. Did you get a splash of the Lethe in the underworld, Aristodemos? He used the same name by which the soldiers had called the instigator of the scheme. It was a reasonable bluff. The man was tanned, unlike all the men who'd just crossed the Styx. Aristodemos slipped his hand off and grimaced. Sorry. You were one of the ones King Leonidas added later? I didn't get to spend much time with you newer men. Didn't even get a chance to learn all your names before you marched off. I'm Bayan. Here's to second chances. It might be a short one. But 2 deaths on the battlefield will grant you twice the glory, and that. Battlefield? He should have guessed. Who would bother returning soldiers to life out of sentiment? There was a war going on, and Aristodemos needed men to fight in it. His pulse quickened. He'd sparred with dead heroes, he knew how to handle a sword and spear. But he'd never had the chance to truly fight anyone. Perhaps he could maintain his dissemblance long enough to fight against the Persians and actually use the skills he'd learned from years of training. First he had to free Myrrine. He didn't have a clear path to her with all the men milling about, exchanging greetings and exclamations of surprise at their escape. They hadn't quite made their way free quite yet. A series of caverns led the way to the sunlit realms, but he had to admit that crossing the Styx was momentous enough. Eventually they formed a loose column and began marching through the caverns. Myrrine had to be walking somewhere near the front, but when he tried to quicken his steps, someone grumbled, "Steady, there. We'll all get out together." He slowed to match their pace. He didn't want to attract any attention that might reveal him as an outsider. But they grew more and more sluggish until they came to a complete halt. Something must be happening in the front lines, and Bayan strained to hear or see what it might be. There was no outcry or obvious obstacle. Instead, a ripple came through the ranks as something was handed from person to person. He didn't realize what they were passing around until his neighbor handed him a waterskin, saying, "Drink this, pass it on." He lifted it reflexively, only to be hit by the pungent smell of blood. He pretended to take a quick swallow, and the next man was eager enough to take the skin away from him. Were these men Ostriges, to thirst so for blood? But he saw how those who had already taken their turn with the waterskin gained color in their cheeks and vitality in their movements. Then he saw Myrrine lying unconscious, her arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage, and he would have happily drained them all of blood himself. His instinctive rush forward was masked by all the men resuming their march. He hastily fell into step but positioned himself in the outer ranks, where he would pass by Myrrine. It was hard to judge her condition from a distance and in this darkness. But her breast still rose to the rhythm of her breath, and Aristodemos, leaning over her, didn't look too alarmed. His lingering meant that when Aristodemos looked up, he caught Bayan's eye. Aristodemos gestured him over. Can you carry the girl?" Bayan lifted her gently, glad to be given charge of her. He misliked the way her unconscious form hung so limply in his arms, but she felt warm and her slack expression was peaceful. He wanted to keep her in his arms forever, so that she might never fall into danger again. Perhaps he could use her weight as an excuse to lag behind, then return to the underworld. He let his steps slow, dropping to the rear of the group and preparing to slip away. Then they rounded the bend in the tunnel, and he saw sunlight pouring down from a rough hole in the ceiling. Most of the men whooped and began babbling with excitement. A few of them reacted the same way Bayan did, silent and reverent. But the shock that held him still was that of realization. This was his chance to explore the sunlit realms. Myrrine stirred. Reflexively he tightened his grip on her. When her eyes slitted open she didn't startle at all, as though she'd expected to awaken and find him holding her. One of her hands rose a little to touch his chest in a trusting gesture. He kept his voice low, although the celebration was loud enough to provide any cover. "We have a chance to leave the underworld. Come with me?" Now surprise showed on her face. But she nodded. He bent down to give her a light kiss on the cheek, like the ones his mother gave him. But some impulse made him change his mark. He moved slowly enough for her to turn aside. Instead, her gaze stayed steady on his. Their mouths met shyly. It felt like falling into a dream. Noise receded except for the drum of his pulse, rising in urgency. A long moment later, he reluctantly lifted his head. An ineffable sweetness clung to his lips, and his body felt strangely loose, as though he could unhinge his bones and take any shape in the world. He wanted to kiss her again and see what happened, then again, and again. The spell broke when Aristodemos stopped by him and asked, "Is she awake?" "No," he said, and Myrrine's eyelids slipped closed obediently. If Aristodemos knew she was conscious, he might make her walk, and Bayan didn't want to be parted from her. He settled her more securely against him. "I'll carry her out." A rough ramp of rocks rose from the cavern floor to the egress. The stones made for uncertain footing, but eventually Bayan emerged under a wide, cloudless sky. He remembered this feeling of utter exposure, the overwhelming presence of mountains and green grass. He flexed his toes, resisting the urge to break into a run for no reason at all. His blood sang with freedom. "Welcome back to the land of the living," Aristodemos called, and the men gave a wordless shout in reply. "I've called you back because the war is dire. The Persians have forced the Athenians to flee from their city. The warriors of Sparta, along with those of the other city-states in the Hellenic alliance, are gathering at Eleusis. We'll join them there, and we'll march together to meet our common enemy. You once showed all of Greece how one of our men is worth 100 Persians. Let us kill hundreds more and drive them from our lands, so that your valor will be upon every man's lips for the second time." Bayan couldn't help raising his voice along with the Spartans. Aristodemos painted a tale of such glory that he thirsted for the chance to fight. It would be an unfair contest, although he could get hurt, he couldn't be killed, but he'd be surprised if the other gods weren't already involved. They had a vested interest in ensuring their worshippers survived an invasion, after all. As the din subsided, one man said wryly, "I'll fight them in my bearskin if need be, but my weapons and armor would be useful." "We'll gather what we need at Eleusis," Aristodemos promised. "What about her?" another soldier asked, pointing unnecessarily. There weren't any other women among them. Every head swung toward Bayan and Myrrine. "We'll take her with us. I owe her parents a debt, and I want to return her to them. She's a respectable maiden in unusual circumstances, do you understand? No one is to touch her." None of the soldiers objected. Bayan relaxed. He wouldn't take his freedom at the price of harm to Myrrine. Guiltily, he remembered her injured arm. She'd already gotten hurt. He knew her, though. She was as curious to see the world as he was. If she'd wanted to head back to the underworld, she wouldn't have nodded. Perhaps she wanted to meet her birth parents. And out here, away from Charon's watchful eye, he'd have the chance to kiss her again. He'd barely just come to the surface and he already had a woman who fit perfectly into his heart, and a chance to experience his first battle. He grinned up at the sun, daring the world to bring him everything it could. Chapter 3. Myrrine was as glad to reach Eleusis as the rest of the men, as her legs ached from days of walking. To be fair, that had been the only real hardship. Beyond the rope bonds, Aristodemos had been solicitous of her well-being, almost too much so. She hadn't had any chance to talk to Bayan with him around. Bayan. His presence had made an untenable situation into an adventure. And he'd kissed her. She ran her tongue over her lips, remembering the moment vividly, and yet certain details escaped her recall. They would have to do it again when she hadn't just recovered consciousness, so she could note every sensation more carefully. Some of her father's passengers had spoken of kisses worthy of swooning. Dubious, she would have tested it with Bayan earlier if not for Charon's ever-watchful eye. Now she thought she should have tried it anyway, so she would have discovered this marvel earlier. Perhaps in Eleusis there would be another opportunity. They didn't actually enter the city, as there were too many Greek soldiers gathering here for there to be enough room under roofs. They set up camp on the fields outside, and Aristodemos, true to form, guided her to the tent he'd given up for her exclusive use. It was there that a man from the Greek army came, no doubt investigating the newly arrived soldiers. Aristodemos nodded to him respectfully. "Greetings, Pausanias." She'd heard of Pausanias from her father's passengers. He was the Spartan regent and commander of the army. He cocked a brow, looking mildly surprised. "Aristodemos? I thought you might have fled from battle again." Myrrine almost flinched in Aristodemos's place. The derision was all the more cutting for that it was expressed so matter-of-factly. Aristodemos's response was calm enough, if stilted. "I brought reinforcements. King Leonidas's honor guard." A pause. "You brought who?" "The 300 who perished at Thermopylae. They fought bravely against the Persians once, and are willing to do so again." "And how can dead men do such a thing?" Pausanias's words were clear and measured, the way one would speak to a child. "I brought them out of the underworld." Pausanias pinched the bridge of his nose. "Do you really expect me to believe this?" Aristodemos clenched his jaw and showed him his palm. "This is where I cut myself, so that their shades could drink my blood and be recalled to life." When Pausanias sighed, she couldn't help herself. This man was doubting her home. She stretched out her arm to reveal her own scar. "Mine as well. It's all true. Surely there are some men still living who would recognize their old comrades." The commander glanced at her. "I would know some of them myself." "Then come see." After a moment, he shrugged. "Fine. Pausanias had only taken a few steps into the camp when he halted, eyes widening. He stood there, watching the soldiers as they built fire pits and cooked their evening meals. There was a strained quality to his voice as he said, "They look just as they did before they died. There's Myrrine and Alpheus, brave men both, as befits brothers. I know they perished at Thermopylae."
"You can speak with them," Aristodemos said. Pausanias shook his head.
His face was pale.
"I'm not sure what you've done abides by the will of the gods.
I'll let them fight with us, but have them keep to themselves. I don't want the other men knowing that the rich one may particularly look forward to seeing some of us back in his realm." It took her a moment to recall that mortals disliked calling Hades by name, referring to him instead by all the wealth buried in the earth he owned. She'd never had to worry about whether she might catch Hades' attention. Living in his realm and befriending his son guaranteed he knew her.
"We need arms and basic supplies. I'll see to it." Pausanias nodded, then left them without farewell.
His orders disappointed Myrrine, as they meant she wouldn't get a chance to explore. Their journey here had been full of new sights, and she'd been hoping to add to them in the city.
She was reluctant even to enter her tent, not while the day was still golden with sun.
She spread her fingers, letting sunlight wrap around each one and trace every line on her palms, turned her hands over and marveled at how different the color of her skin was here. Every hue was richer, more luminous.
"Are you still bitter at me for taking you out of the underworld?"
Instead of moving off, Aristodemos had stayed a short distance away, watching her. She considered the question. He'd treated her surprisingly well, discounting her initial abduction and the bloodletting. The cut on her arm had healed cleanly, and the abduction had brought her out into the sunlit lands. He made sure she had enough food and water each day, and had given her his own cloak to sleep in. And none of the soldiers had ever made so much as an inappropriate comment to her, thanks to his insistence that she be treated respectfully.
"You haven't caused me any real grief."
That was a good suggestion, to let Pausanias recognize the men.
He eyed her. "Will you promise not to run off if I untie your feet?" She nodded.
Bion was here, and she wasn't going to go anywhere without him. Her words seemed to suffice. He drew his sword and cut the ropes. She massaged her ankles, grateful to have the full freedom of her limbs again.
A little awkwardly, he said, "Did you want to see the city? You've been in the underworld your entire life, and I've barely given you any opportunity to look around." He coughed.
"And you need new clothes."
She looked down at her garb. It had accumulated a fair amount of travel grime. "I thought we weren't supposed to leave camp."
"Only those men who died at Thermopylae and might be recognized."
"That's neither of us."
She didn't need any more persuasion.
"Let's go." Even during wartime the city bustled with people and activity.
The marketplace was overwhelming, a din of criers calling out special prices, the strange mixed smells of spices and fish, the crush of bodies. Aristodemos navigated these effortlessly, and she stayed close to him. He bought her a tunic and cloak from a second-hand clothier's stall. The bargaining fascinated her. No one had ever tried to coax Sharon into accepting a lower fee. But the rapid exchange of offers and counteroffers was hard for her to follow, and left her wondering how she would fare on her own here. Poorly, she suspected. As they left the stall, a man bumped into them. He started to apologize, then stopped, staring at Aristodemos.
"If it isn't Aristodemos the Trembler. Shouldn't you be running away already? If you wait too long you might get caught up in the battle." Aristodemos lurched forward, fists ready, then stopped.
He was indeed trembling, but with suppressed rage. "I'd rather have our strength turned against the Persians and not wasted on each other."
"Coward," the other man sneered, and turned away. Aristodemos stared after him, white-faced.
Myrrine waited a moment before she touched his elbow.
"What was that about?" "I need a drink."
He turned on his heel and headed straight for a wine shop. He was able to afford only a cheap skin, but judging from the way he drank it, the taste wasn't what he sought. Myrrine had coaxed countless tales out of men before. She waited, knowing that the words would come. Men who suffered injustices always felt the need to speak of them. He spoke in a low voice, not looking at her. "They call me that because King Leonidas sent me away from the battle at Thermopylae. He had chosen only 300 of us to fight with him, but while in camp Eurydice and I were struck by some disease of the eye that left us blind, so he sent us back. We were both feverish, but where it left me feeble, it took Eurydice with battle fury, and he ordered his slave to guide him back to Thermopylae. He fought the Persians even though he couldn't see, and he died with our comrades. So I alone of the 300 returned alive." She could imagine the reception that had awaited him. Though a defeat, Thermopylae was hailed as a valiant last stand, and Spartans spoke of it proudly. Aristodemos had had a chance to be part of it, but in the eyes of his people, had unforgivably allowed weakness to overcome him. "So you're trying to bring about a second chance to stand with the 300, she said. "Only this time you plan to acquit yourself better." She found she liked the idea of second chances. They almost never happened in the underworld. He jerked his head up and down. "I don't care if my eyes rot in my head, or if my hands are chopped off and I can't even hold a spear. I will fight using my teeth if I must." She ran her fingers along the scab on her arm. He'd taken her blood to raise those men from the dead, but he'd used his own as well. She reached out and took his palm, the one with the twin scar. "Aristodemos, son of Cleitos, I wish you much glory, but..." Some of the weariness left his eyes when he smiled at her. As they returned to the camp, a messenger stopped Aristodemos and spoke with him in rapid undertones. When he rejoined her, his expression was distracted. "The Athenians have joined up with us. We'll be leaving for Erythrae tomorrow. I'll find you someplace to stay in the city." She frowned. "But there's one more thing I want to see." He opened his hand palm up, amenable. "I want to see the battle." He paled. "Have you gone witless? It's no place for a woman, and I promised your parents to bring you to them safely." At least he wasn't calling her a girl anymore. "I'm not likely to be safe on my own here in Eleusis," she pointed out. "Out there you can offer me your protection, the way you've been doing all this time. I can stay in the army's camp and watch the fighting from there. People will think I'm just a slave you've brought along. And what if we lose? Think of what will happen to you then. Bion will save me. Then you can't take me to my parents anyway, can you? And I can at least be a witness to your final battle." He shook his head, but looked resigned. "If you insist. I'm going to start posting a sentry outside your tent for your safety, though." She couldn't find a reason to object. And given how many strange Greeks were about, perhaps it was a good idea. He handed her the clothes he'd bought before she ducked inside the tent, so she decided to change into them. The tunic and cloak were easy enough to slip on, it was harder to make sure the drapes fell properly and the cloak didn't slip off. As she tried rearranging the fabric, she could make out Aristodemos talking outside with another soldier, apparently her sentry for tonight. "Remember, no one's to touch her. That includes you." The response was indistinct but must have reassured Aristodemos, for she heard him walking away. But as soon as his footsteps faded, the guard ducked into the tent, the crest of his helm brushing against the flaps. She snatched up the closest object at hand, a water gourd, and brandished it in both hands. "Not another step." He made a choked sound, as though stifling a laugh. "Myrrine, it's me." He raised his helmet, propping it atop his head. "Bion." She remembered at the last moment to keep her voice low, and his name came out in a squeak. She started to toss the gourd aside, but he gestured frantically and she set it down with more care before rushing toward him. Her cloak got in the way and she tripped on its hem. He leapt forward to steady her. She yanked at the fabric impatiently, trying to restore it to its graceful folds. "This thing is ridiculous." When she looked up, his gaze was resting on her tunic. He colored. "I've never seen you wearing anything but sailor's garb." She eyed him speculatively. "And you're all in armor." She'd known Bion forever and counted him as familiar as the sound of the sticks. But now he stood in armor that emphasized his lean physique, the smell of leather and sweat new to him. He hadn't stepped back after helping her recover her balance, and her skin prickled from his proximity. He tugged at the yoke of his breastplate in a self-conscious manner. "It's heavy, and it doesn't quite fit right." "Then you should take it off." She shed her cloak altogether, letting it slide down her bare arms. The cool air didn't help with the growing heat she felt. "I might need it in case we get caught." His voice came out husky and he cleared his throat. The corners of her mouth curled upward irrepressibly. So he wasn't unaffected either. "Caught doing this?" She slid her fingers into his hair and pulled his head down to kiss him. He crushed her to him, his tongue tangling with hers. This kiss was fiercer than the first, urgent and far more thorough. Her senses flared, and all she could feel or taste or smell was him. His palm slid down her back as though memorizing the curve of her spine and rump, and she arched into that caress. When he moved his mouth to her neck, she moaned. The sensation was so overwhelming she didn't notice how busy his fingers were at the pins on her shoulders until her tunic slipped downward. "Wait." She drew back, panting. He bit back a groan. "Sorry. I got carried away." She laughed. "No, your armor's cold against my skin. I meant it when I told you to take it off." His hands flew over the laces. Clad only in his tunic, he pushed her down to the mat and lay down beside her. He kissed her throat and traced the curves of her breasts, making her shiver with desire. Restlessly, she slid one of her legs over his. He hitched his hips forward and she felt his arousal pressing against her. So many new things to experience here in the sunlit lands, and here was one that mixed the warm familiarity of an old friend with the excitement of discovering the alchemy of their bodies together. "Bayan, I don't want a child yet," she whispered, and he said softly back, "All right." Instead he explored her with his fingers and tongue. She bloomed like a fountain under his caresses, biting the heel of her palm to smother her cry. He didn't stop, and she writhed as he inflamed newly discovered nerves. One of her questing hands found his erection and the catch in his breath emboldened her. She experimented with the pressure and speed of her strokes, marveling at how she could draw out these noises from him, desperate words and sounds, until he finally breathed her name with astonished wonder and spilled into her hand. The tent was filled with the sound of their breathing and their mixed scents. "That, we never could have done on Karen's boat," he said with feeling. She laughed and laid her cheek against his chest. He stroked her hair, sweaty though it was. It was still so easy and comfortable with him, even after what they'd done. She could talk to him as she always had. "How did you find me?" "I saw a bunch of soldiers waiting on the shore. They thought I was one of them when I joined them, and Sharon let me cross. When you fainted, Aristodemos asked me to carry you. I was going to try to sneak back to the sticks when I saw the sunlight, and I realized this was our chance to explore out here." His expression turned sheepish. "Although I guess you haven't gotten to see much. Aristodemos took me around Eleusis. It was dizzying." "Aristodemos?" There was an undercurrent in his voice. She pushed at his shoulder. "Don't be jealous. He thinks of me as his ward. And he's letting me stay with the army when it heads out tomorrow. Is that wise? I've heard so much about battles. I want to see one, at least, since they've sent so many people to the underworld. And those other soldiers, my blood helped turn them from shades into living men again. In a way, they're of my making. I should see how they fare." "Sharon will kill me when he hears I took you into a battle," he predicted gloomily. "You're immortal." If anything, she was the one her father would be angry with, for not searching for a way to let him know she was all right. She hadn't spared a thought for him in all the excitement of the sunlit realms. "I hope they're not too angry with us." "Our fathers?" She nodded. "If my father really wanted me back, he'd come get me. And Sharon knows I'm with you." She lifted her head. "Are we going to go back?" The underworld seemed very far away, and there was so much more to see. A lifetime's worth. He looked at her seriously. "Only if we want to." Reassured by that she drowsed until he shifted under her. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "My guard shift will be ending soon." She helped him put his armor back on. She couldn't help teasing him a bit, running her hands along his legs as she clipped on his greaves. He retaliated by giving her a long, hard kiss before leaving the tent. Her dreams were full of him and how she might have responded to that kiss under different circumstances. The next day they marched out of Eleusis. They made camp by the Asopos River, the Persian fort visible on the other side with its walls of earth and wood circling about countless tents. Neither force moved for days. Aristodemos explained to her that their seer had made sacrifices, and the omens warned against attacking first. The soldiers still mustered into ranks every morning, and the Persians sent light cavalry forces to harass them, trying to taunt them into a disastrous charge. She watched from a safe spot up in the foothills, away from the slaves and the others who stayed in the camp. The Persians had mostly sent their horsemen along the western wing of the Greek army, the Spartans were posted to the east. If she was impatient, Bayan had to be itching for battle. "Myrrine?" She turned and broke into a smile at the sight of Hermes. Of course he'd be near the battlefield. When the dead were buried, he guided their spirits to the underworld. "Greetings, Hermes. What are you doing here?" She hated dissembling, but this wasn't the time to go into the full tale. "I just wanted to explore the sunlit realms." He gave her a stern look. "I should take you straight back to the sticks. Sharon must be worried about you." "I know. Could you tell him I'm all right the next time you see him?" He sighed. He'd always had a soft spot for her. "I will. And I'll try to keep an eye on you, now that I know you're here. But I can't do anything for you if you wander onto the battlefield. "Why not?" She had no plans to do so, but wasn't that the foremost place she'd need his protection? "The gods have sworn not to change the course of the war in any way." She blinked. "That seems out of character." Hades was an exception, concerning himself only with the underworld, but most of the other gods were infamous for meddling in mortal affairs. His expression turned wry. The Persians have their own set of divinities, the Yazatas. It wouldn't help the mortals on either side if this became a battle between gods. She imagined the destruction that would come about from a fight on such a scale and shivered. So you've both agreed to do nothing. His fingers twitched. The enforced inactivity clearly didn't sit well with him.
Yes. If you want company watching, this is a good vantage point. Of the very little that's happening, that is.
The Persians destroyed the Greek supply lines, Hermes said.
Something will have to happen soon.
She stole a glance at him at his grim tone.
Do you think we'll lose? She'd never really considered the possibility before.
There had always been Greek warriors falling in battle and coming to the underworld, and then there had always been more.
Surely this time would be no different. Hermes's mouth twisted. It seems likely, the way things are going.
We didn't think the Persians would get this far in the first place. After a moment he added, but Greek soldiers have surprised me before. She thought of the 300 men who had already surprised the Persians once. If anyone's courage could make a difference, it would be theirs. She rubbed at the scar on her arm and waited for the battle to begin. The reality of war was rather different from the tales she discovered over the next few days. There seemed to be a great deal of standing around and biding one's time for the other side to make the first move. At least Aristodemos gave her updates in the evenings when they retired to camp, and Hermes kept her informed during the day when he met her at their observation point in the foothills.
More cavalry.
Hermes pointed out the horsemen to her, crossing the ground between the two armies.
Those Persians are persistent.
If they were going to provoke a charge, it would have happened by now.
Why don't they just attack?
The Greeks are staying on higher ground. The Persians can handle a few skirmishes, but the bulk of their army would struggle on that sort of terrain. If they can draw us onto those flat plains, their cavalry will have the upper hand. The Persians were riding to the east this time, where the Spartans were stationed. The two sides engaged, the figures distant enough that the charge and ensuing clash seemed almost like an elaborate pantomime. Myrrine shaded her eyes and pointed to one of the many armed figures on the Greek side.
I think that's Bion. It looks like he'll get to fight today. I hope he won't be badly hurt.
Hermes whirled on her.
Bion? Why didn't you tell me he was here?
He's an adult, she said distractedly, trying to better make out the fight where he was.
Don't you think it's time he was allowed out of the underworld?
Hermes's reaction, so different from when he discovered her here, puzzled her. Then the pieces fell into place and she turned to look at him, aghast.
His fighting counts as interference by a god, doesn't it? Hermes nodded, mouth set in a grim line. I need to go.
Stay safe. She grabbed at his sleeve.
What will happen to him? I don't know.
He left her holding nothing, not even a reassurance. And when she turned back to the battle, she couldn't see Bion anymore either. Her stomach clenched, and although she kept gazing out toward the battlefield, she was too numb to pay any attention to the fighting.
There was only one person she wanted to see.
Gods might be immortal, but they could be hurt, especially by each other. There was no telling what would happen to Bion, and no way for her to find out. Screams finally pulled her thoughts out of their mire of worry.
Spartan soldiers were trained from a young age to withstand cold, deprivation, and cruelty.
They went to their deaths in battle proudly. So when the shrieking began, she knew the Persians must have brought out something truly terrifying. She saw it immediately.
It was a monster with a human head and a lion's body.
Its tail was from yet another beast, a scorpion, she thought, from the way it arced overhead and speared a Greek. Something was terribly wrong with its mouth, which gaped open. She squinted and shuddered in revulsion as she made out 3 rows of pointed teeth. They clamped down on half of the soldier. It chewed with evident relish. Apparently it preferred fresh meat, for instead of finishing the rest of the body, it pounced on a new victim and rent him into pieces.
It bent down to feed from the carnage, its appetite undiminished.
She watched with horror and rising bile as it steadily ate its way through the Greek ranks. The soldiers who approached it were hurtled away by a flick of its tail, and it moved so swiftly that no one seemed able to touch it, let alone wound it. A number of arrows were embedded in its skin, but these seemed to bother it no more than gnat bites. She wasn't sure the entire Greek army could bring down this beast. And once it was done with the men on the battlefield, what was to stop it from moving on to the camp, and then the rest of Greece? Chapter 4. Bion fit smoothly into the phalanx with his shield resting against his knees, spear planted in the ground, just like every other soldier. What he really wanted was a stool to stand upon so he could see what was going on. They'd been marching out to this line every morning for the past several days, only to stand and then return to camp at night.
Was anything happening on that battlefield?
Nikias, his neighbor to the right, was taller and had a better view.
He dropped back down onto his heels and said, I think those mounted bastards are finally giving our wing a try. It'll be good to actually get to fight. I only wish we'd had the chance to see our wives one more time, eh? He was one of the Spartans who'd followed Aristodemos out of the underworld, and he and Bion had grown acquainted while sharing some camp duties. Nicias hadn't seen anything strange in not knowing Bion from before, and not only because he wasn't particularly bright. Apparently King Leonidas had assembled his 300 men not only from his established honor guard, but also from other Spartan warriors who had sons to survive them. Bion had had to pretend that he had a wife and child back in Sparta. He grunted, not wanting to lie any more than he had to. Nicias had spoken true. The Persian cavalry thundered toward them. Over the sound of the horses' hooves he could hear war pipes, and all the Spartans added their voices in song. Without that music to hold them together, Bion would have been tempted to disregard the commander's orders not to engage unless the Persians came to them. His nerves screamed at him to rush forward and clash with them now. But he stood steady with his comrades. The front line closed with the enemy and the impact rippled back through the phalanx. He lifted his shield and held his spear steady as the ranks dissolved into chaos. A Persian loomed in front of him. It was the work of instinct to raise his weapon and jab at the soft, vulnerable spot of flesh showing above his scale armor. Blood sprayed. The man fell back, his mouth spreading open in an expression of permanent surprise. It was all too easy. One more denizen of the underworld. Then Nicias dropped his shield and spear, grabbed the Persian, and began to feed on the blood running from the wound Bion had just dealt. The Persians began to shriek. Bion couldn't understand their language, but a single word seemed to be repeated often, "Gulls." A number of them broke away and galloped back to their side of the field. Even the Greeks wavered in the face of such bizarre behavior. Another Spartan stared at the scene. "Nicias?" he said, voice rising in disbelief. "Aren't you dead?" Nicias dropped the Persian's body. "I was. But human blood gives me life again, see?" He held out his hand, tanned after days of marching. "We only needed it the once," someone said in disgust. "Down in the caverns. There's no need to drink anymore." Babel arose. In the confusion, a voice said clearly, "Bion, we need to go." He whirled around. There was no one behind him. He raised his shield. "Who's there?" "It's Hermes." He relaxed. The messenger god had a cloak which could render him invisible, so oddly, not being able to see Hermes proved his identity. "Greetings, Hermes." "Go where?" "Can it wait?" "To Olympus." "And no, it can't." His stomach dropped. A summons to the home of the gods wasn't made lightly. "Why?" Impatience edged Hermes' voice. "You can ask Zeus himself." "Let's go." The war, Myrrine. Hands grabbed Bion and he was suddenly airborne. He closed his eyes against the dizzying rush of wind. When he opened them again, Olympus was already looming over them, and Hermes was still taking them higher. They broke through the clouds and began slowing down as a palace came into view. He preferred his father's domicile, bleak though it could be with its black marble and low ceilings. These gleaming walls and archways, tall enough for a titan to fit under, were intended to intimidate. It was working rather well. They landed and Hermes showed himself at last. Bion had met him before when he delivered the dead to Sharon. What was new was the irritation on his face. Were those Spartans dead? The ones taking blood? Hermes demanded. Once. They escaped the underworld. You incredible fool. Before Bion could scrape up a properly indignant reply, Hermes seized his arm and bore him toward the throne room. Zeus, the ruler of the gods, sat in the center. His aura was as brilliant as his hallmark weapon, the thunderbolt, and its brightness would have blinded mortal eyes. Bion resisted the urge to squint and cleared his throat. Greetings, Zeus. Greetings, Bion, Zeus rumbled. Do you know why I had Hermes bring you here? He could think of a number of possibilities. Not precisely. I wanted to talk to you, instead of punishing you, because it seems you were never told of the strictures in place. When we made the pact, you were young and living in the underworld. I should have realized that could change. Bion said cautiously, what pact? When the Persian army invaded Greece, all the gods made an agreement with the Yazatas that none of us would interfere. He was even more lost. The Yazatas? The Persian divinities. Between us, we'd end up destroying Greece before either side won. Zeus leaned forward, scowling. So you can imagine how happy I was to see you fighting in the very war no gods are supposed to influence, alongside men who have already died once. Bion glared back, tired of the blame heaped atop him. I didn't release the Spartans from the underworld. You just happened to join their number? It was a way out. Zeus sighed.
You're your mother's child, I see. Bion hadn't been trying to leave the underworld at first, just rescue Myrrine, but he held his tongue. He suspected the ruler of the gods wouldn't appreciate that all this trouble had been precipitated by a woman.
He'd heard about Helen of Troy.
You'll have to withdraw from the fighting. I'll have a word with Hades about the men from the underworld, but if none of us had anything to do with it, I don't see that we're obligated to pull them out as well. Bion thought he detected a note of satisfaction in those last words. The Greeks weren't faring well in the war, and perhaps Zeus was foregoing punishment not because of Bion's ignorance, but because he'd helped their side. Less sanguinely, Zeus went on, of course, because of you, the Persians now feel justified in unleashing their own surprise.
What surprise? A manticore.
It eats men, and it'll devour a path straight through the Greek army.
Myrrine. Can I still return to the battlefield?
Not to fight, he added hastily.
No. You've done enough harm, boy. Go to your mother. Bion bristled at this offhand dismissal. I don't even know where she. Hermes took a firm grasp on his elbow. Come on.
This time he took Bion to a garden. He could see a slender figure standing under a willow tree, but Hermes didn't release him yet. I'm fond of Myrrine, and for some reason she likes you, so I'll give you a piece of advice: don't argue with Zeus.
If you want something from him, make him happy with you, not angry. Bion could care less about his own welfare. Will you make sure she's all right? Hermes's mouth tightened.
I'll do what I can, but the gods are going to be watching very closely to make sure there's no more meddling.
She's not part of the army.
The sooner you go to your mother, the sooner I can get back to Myrrine, Hermes said pointedly.
Bion swallowed his next words and headed for the willow. Greetings, mother. She turned. Bion? What are you doing here?
Her tone was mild, and he relaxed. Of course she would be the last person to object to his leaving the underworld.
Zeus thought you could keep me out of trouble, but...
He tried to make a jest of it, but the look she turned on him was thoughtful.
And are you in trouble? He juggled several responses and came up with, no?
She reached out to adjust the shoulder of his tunic. Normally her fussing annoyed him, but the maternal gesture reassured him today. She'd been absent for much of his life, and when she was around he often avoided her because she seemed perpetually angry in the underworld, but he knew she did love him.
What happened?
She asked now, her eyes dark with concern. So he told her how he'd fallen in with the Spartans and joined the battle against the Persians. Her expression turned bleak, but she didn't interrupt him. After he explained how Zeus had sent him here, she sat quietly, her thoughts directed inward.
Finally she sighed. It's just as well you're here.
Oh? Aside from Myrrine's kiss when she'd woken to find him carrying her, this was the most enthusiastic welcome he'd received. I was trying to see if there was a goddess free to marry you, and you might as well have some say in the matter.
There's a nymph that might do. He'd just been torn from a battle and his mother was concerned about his marriage prospects? What about Myrrine? The ferryman's foundling? She frowned.
You could wed her, I suppose, but why not save yourself the grief?
He lifted his chin. What grief? I love her.
Her expression softened.
Oh, Bion. She's mortal.
For a moment he thought Zeus had felled him with one of his thunderbolts. But the sky was rent by no lightning. It was only his heart that crumpled. Myrrine had been there for as long as he could remember, but someday she would die, and he would live without her forever. He began to pace. Perhaps he could take his mother's suggestion and marry someone else, try to think of Myrrine no more. But they could still have decades together, decades during which he would have to watch her grow old. And at the end of them, he would have to bury her, and in his father's realm perhaps encounter her shade, dull and listless and nothing like her in life. I'll petition Zeus, he said at last.
Ask him to grant her immortality.
She raised her brows.
And eternal youth as well, don't forget.
But these things aren't given lightly, and you haven't exactly found favor with him.
How do you know that?
Bion, he sent you to your mother.
He conceded the point with an impatient flick of his fingers.
So I'll have to make sure he's pleased with me. Her expression was expectant. He wants Greece to win this war, he said.
I'll help make that happen. No. You mustn't.
Persephone gripped his arm to still him.
The gods have all promised not to meddle. I won't do anything directly. As long as it can be traced to you, you'll be blamed. And if you want to take credit for it, it'll have to be traceable.
He groaned and buried his face in his hands. Is she worth all this effort? His mother sounded dubious.
I'm sure I can find someone lovelier. This nymph. He raised his head. Mother, don't you wish you'd had a choice in your marriage?
Her expression froze, then she turned her face away. I wasn't planning for you to abduct the nymph and force her, she said stiffly. Regretting his thoughtless words, he caught her hands. I meant that a love match would have saved you grief.
Love? She laughed humorlessly.
I believe your father truly loves me.
He's never looked at another woman since we wed,
and I've given him plenty of reason to. And any number of women would have him gladly. He's a strong king, and he's shown mercy at times. If he had come wooing me, I would have been tempted.
But instead,
he shifted uncomfortably. It was almost worse to hear his mother describe Hades as a man worthy of anything more than her scorn. It meant his father had destroyed a chance at true happiness. I think Myrrine feels the way I do. She studied him not as a mother looks at her son, but with the cold gaze that had weighed Hades and always found him wanting.
The two of you. Not yet.
For the first time he was grateful he and Myrrine hadn't shared themselves with each other to the fullest. However much they both might have wanted it, he suspected that his mother's judgment would have gone against him.
But we have an understanding.
If she survives. She's crossed the Styx 1,000,000 times without perishing of boredom. Surely she can manage another 100 times.
She hasn't gone back to the underworld.
I left her at the Spartan camp in Plataea, where the Greeks and Persians are fighting. His mother glanced at him sharply.
You took her to the site of a battle?
He rubbed the back of his neck. She wanted to witness it. I thought she should get a chance. Perhaps the nymph wasn't the right choice after all, Persephone murmured. He wished she'd stop talking about that nymph.
Myrrine's in real danger. There's nothing you can do.
Zeus will likely strike you down if you set a single toe on that battlefield.
He's not going to brook any disobedience from you after you've already broken his edict. What can I do?
She looked at him sadly.
There's nothing to do but wait. It's up to the fates.
If Myrrine doesn't survive, at least you can see her in the underworld. It was a cold comfort. He remembered Nikia's wishing that they could see the women they loved again one last time. He shouldn't have brushed off the other man's words.
Chapter 5.
Myrrine was still frozen in shock, watching the monster cut a bloody swath across the battlefield, when she felt a rush of air. Hermes stood beside her in silence.
Of course he wouldn't interfere. This is allowed? She asked tightly. After what Bion did?
Yes. She bit her lip and turned to him, finally distracted from the slaughter. I'm sure no one told him. He wouldn't have defied the edict knowingly.
That's why Zeus didn't punish him. He let out an aggrieved breath.
No one expected he'd end up here, and certainly not with the dead in tow. That's what alerted the Persians and got us into this mess. Of course, it turns out that the dead aren't an issue, at least for the gods, since apparently a mortal brought them out from the underworld. But Bion was still a problem. Her heart thumped.
Where is he, if he wasn't punished? He might have escaped blame once, but he's not allowed to come back here.
You need to worry about yourself, especially with that manticore out there.
I don't suppose you'd be willing to flee?
I can't carry you away, not with everyone hawk-eyed for violations, but you could probably run to the nearest city on your own.
No. I want to see this out.
She returned her gaze to the plain. Something about the massacre caught her attention and she watched with more care. As the manticore continued its rampage through the battlefield, she was certain at least one of the men it devoured screamed in Persian he must have been a cavalryman who had been too late to withdraw to his side. The monster appeared to be indiscriminate in its source of food. The manticore. Footsteps pounded toward her and Hermes disappeared as Aristodemos rushed into view. We have to go. Now. He gestured impatiently. What? He was the last person she'd expected to suggest flight. She stood tall and lifted her chin. Where? Perhaps he meant to fulfill his oath and return her to her parents. Or perhaps his flight from the battle at Thermopylae had been cowardice after all. Where do you think? He snapped. Back to the underworld. We need more soldiers. Only the once dead seem willing to stand up to that thing out there. She stared at him evenly. If you think I'll put my father through that again, you're mistaken. He's not even your father. Then you don't have any leverage against him, do you? He abandoned that tack. Do you see what's going on out there? Those are Greek warriors being eaten by a beast while they defend our homeland. My home is the underworld, she thought. But she had to agree that the war was doing no good, too many brave men were dying. Charon had to be exhausted from ferrying all the dead.
Give it a reason to turn around, she suggested. He looked at her blankly. It doesn't care whether it's eating Greeks or Persians. It's just grabbing the nearest man in front of it. If you face it toward their side. His face cleared, then fell. How can we do that? It's too massive to move and too quick to get close to. I think it'll turn around if it's deprived of anything in front of it. He flinched as though she'd offered him an abomination. Retreat? It's that or die, she was about to say, but she changed her choice of words to better appeal to his Spartan principles, lose. Think of it as repositioning. It'll probably chase after anything that moves anyway, he said. That's how predators behave. If we withdraw, it'll just follow. Then if movement attracts it, give it a target. Have someone run past it and lead it into the bulk of the Persian force. That's a suicide mission. A dark expression passed over his face. I'll do it. Aristodemos. He paused. Don't try to talk me out of it, Myrrine. It was the first time he'd used her name. I won't. The words felt heavy on her tongue. Honor was a weighty thing. Just tell me where my parents live before you go. He told her. He made her give the directions back to him so he could be sure she'd learned them. Then he turned to rejoin the army. I wish you much glory, Aristodemos, son of Cleitos, she said to his back. She watched his progress through the ranks. Even in the disordered lines it was easy to spot him. For all their vaunted courage, few Greek soldiers seemed willing to face the monster. Aristodemos wove around them, always pressing forward. When he broke through the front lines, he hollered like a madman to catch the manticore's attention. Thankfully he was wise enough not to run directly at it, veering around and behind it instead. Just before he crashed into the Persian army, he twisted and hurled his spear at it. The manticore whipped around. Yes. Myrrine clapped her hands in triumph. Then she froze as the beast fell upon Aristodemos. He never flinched as it closed the distance. It wasn't a pretty death. But it was quick. The blood that had given life to 300 of Sparta's bravest warriors splashed across the ground. She blinked to clear her eyes of tears. She wanted to witness his last moments. No man could call him a coward after today. When it finished eating him and looked up, it was facing the Persian force. One of the Persians dropped his spear to bolt. The manticore gathered its haunches beneath itself and sprang. Despite the distance, it landed immediately behind him to rip off his head and feast on the body. That set all the nearby Persians into a panic, and the monster picked them off, its attention caught by one, then another fleeing soldier. The tide seems to have turned, Hermes said from beside her, sounding rather smug. Myrrine watched more somberly. She couldn't watch so much senseless death with any joy, even if the fallen were the invaders. As though her wish had been given force, the manticore disappeared. Everyone froze. Both the Greeks and the Persians seemed shocked. Myrrine's only clue as to what had happened came from Hermes. Interference. He crowed. The Yazatas must have taken the beast away when it turned on the Persians, and using their powers to effect the battle was in direct contravention of the pact. Does that mean you can do what you want now? She asked. No. But they'll have to grant us a concession. What will you ask for? He patted her arm. I'll let you know. Then he was gone, and she was left to wait again. Both armies were in disarray. The Greeks regrouped and the Persians retreated to their side of the river. Neither side seemed inclined to make an offensive move, and they returned to camp somewhat earlier than when the sun began to set. Myrrine stayed where she was instead of going back to her tent. Aristodemos wouldn't be there to tell her what was happening. Bion was gone. Her eyes felt swollen from crying, and her heart ached too much to let her sleep anyway. She sat down and hugged her knees. So she was able to see the Greek army begin to steal away in the darkness. It was a measured withdrawal, so it must have been planned. Perhaps they were seeking a better defensive position because they didn't know that the manticore wouldn't be back. She thought about running over and trying to find Pausanias to let him know, but that might count as interference, since she only knew because Hermes had told her. Aristodemos' sacrifice might come to nothing. Although, as she watched, the Spartans didn't move. Were they meant to be a rear guard for the rest of the army? But even as the night waned, they stayed in place. The bulk of the Greek force was definitely retreating, while the Spartans remained steadfast in their positions. Of course they would consider such a move to be disgraceful. It must seem like a cowardly flight from battle. But their stubbornness only left them horribly exposed. The commander finally came to his senses, and the Spartans began to follow the other Greeks. But the sky was already brightening, and in the dawnlight, the Spartans presented too tempting a target.
Across the river came battle cries. The Persian army charged.
Chapter 6. Hermes sped into the garden.
Bion had seldom seen him in any disarray, but now his hair and eyes were wild. His news had to be urgent.
Let it not be Myrrine. What happened? Persephone asked.
The Azatas broke our accord, and as recompense, they've agreed to allow us a single advantage.
Bion's head snapped up. What advantage?
You can join the battle come morning, when the fighting starts up again.
Persephone bristled. Is this a form of punishment?
No, Hermes glanced aside, embarrassed. It's because he still hasn't come into his powers, so he's the weakest of the gods.
How dare you? Bion touched his mother's arm. It's true enough.
Her expression frightened him. He was used to her chilly anger when she argued with his father, but this white-faced fury was something far more dangerous. And it'll give me a chance to keep Myrrine from harm and win Zeus's favor. She shook off his hand.
You're going to be too busy fighting to moon over her. And you can still be harmed, you know. I've trained in Elysium. You realize all the gods will be watching you? A single move could shame you. Mother. Let me go. She fell silent.
He felt a twinge of guilt. Those words had particular resonance for her.
But she nodded.
Before you go, I had Hephaestus begin fashioning armor and weapons for you. I meant them to be a wedding gift, but you'll make better use of them now. Hermes held up a hand to forestall her.
We're not supposed to help in any way.
She stared him down. It is a mother's gift to her son.
Would you have me send him to battle without properly arming him?
His hand dropped.
No.
She took Bion to the smith god's cave, where Hephaestus worked tirelessly to fit a breastplate and greaves of gleaming bronze to his body. The spear given him was sturdy in his hand, the sword perfectly balanced, the shield emblazoned with 3 dogs' heads. His mother set the helmet atop his head. Its dyed horsehair crest made him feel taller. You look like a proper warrior, she said, stepping back.
Fight well, my son. I wish you much glory.
He bent his head to her. It was the first time she'd spoken to him as more than a boy. Hermes whisked him back to Plataea as morning was breaking over the plain.
Nicias saw him first. Bion. I thought you must have fallen.
I had to get new arms, Bion said vaguely.
I'm glad you're all right.
Everything's in shambles. Most of the other Greeks moved off, and only the Tegeans still stand with us.
The gods seem to have turned their backs on us.
Bion gripped his shoulder and looked directly into his eyes. Trust me, the gods favor us.
He released Nicias. Ready to fight?
His conviction must have heartened the other man.
To victory. After a moment he added, if I fall first, you might want to leave extra drachmas with my body. The ferryman's sure to be pissed with me.
I'll put in a word for you, Bion promised.
Nicias laughed.
No, remember, this is if I die before you. But the ground shook as the Persians neared. This wasn't the time to reveal the nature of his relationship with Sharon. He and Nicias lowered their helmets into place, hunched under their shields, and waited for the command to engage. As per the custom, the Spartan seer killed a goat which had been brought along for this purpose. He studied its guts and shook his head.
Sacrifice again, Pausanias said, his voice taut. Bion could see the Persians closing in on them rapidly.
Arrows began to rain down upon them.
Another goat was brought out. The seer sliced it open.
Near them, a roar and the rumble of soldiers marching. The Tegeans had received favorable omens and were moving to meet the Persians. The Spartans shifted, muttering. The seer held up the entrails with a triumphant cry.
Pausanias called out, advance.
And the warpipe seconded him, playing a battle hymn with a steady rhythm they could move their feet to.
The phalanx held fast in formation until they were almost upon the Persian infantry.
The armies clashed. Bion lifted his spear, and something broke free inside him, a sudden conviction that he could wreak whatever he wished in this place. His vision seemed to shift, everything about him seemed to grow sharp in focus, and smaller somehow.
Puny, even.
He snapped the spear down and a Persian folded under him. It took no effort at all to take out another one, the Persian's face frozen in shock at his speed. This was how it felt to be a god in the fullness of his powers.
Everything blurred after that. He only knew that he killed.
Men fell about him like sheaves of wheat. Dimly, he was aware of other Greeks around him, of Nicias dying his second death without ever seeing his wife and son again, but most of his attention was reserved for his opponents, numerous as ants and as feeble against him. They tried to attack him, but he brushed them away and left them broken in his tracks. They were only mortals.
Someone grabbed his arm.
He whirled to attack and stopped with his spear point directly in front of the Spartan soldier's eye. The other man didn't blink.
You've been blessed by the gods today, I think. He pointed past Bion. On the white horse, that's their general. Can you reach him?
Bion bared his teeth in answer. They fought their way through the general's honor guard. These Persians were more skilled and better armed, but they died no differently from the others.
Bion focused on that white steed as his lodestone.
The Spartan followed, dispatching those he struck down but didn't have time to finish off. At some point his spear broke, so he drew his sword. Then, just as they reached that white horse, a Persian leapt in front of him. Bion buried his sword in the man's chest, too deeply. When he pulled, even with a foot braced on the dead man's ribs, the blade refused to slide out. Bare hands were all he needed. He sprang forward and pulled the general off his mount. The general gaped at him from the ground, and scrabbled backwards on his hands. The Spartan who'd fought with him had already lost both his weapons. He looked about and seized a large rock from the ground. He raised it high, then heaved it down on the general's head.
His skull broke open. The Persians raised a panicked cry and began to flee.
There were more Greeks with them here now, soldiers coming to support the Spartans. Like a tide they rushed the battlefield, pursuing the Persians to their fort. The earth and wooden walls held them off for a short while, but the Greeks tore them down and stormed the camp like furies unleashed. They slaughtered every man they could find. Bion came to himself surrounded by corpses. The air was redolent with the rusty smell of blood. At first he thought it was from all the fresh-cut bodies around him. Then he realized the stink came from the blood covering him from head to foot. That was a feat worthy of Achilles, Hermes said, coming to stand next to him.
You can hardly compare. I'm a god. So you are. You chose a good time to come into your powers.
They looked out over the battlefield together. The Persian army had been completely devastated, their fort razed, their dead numbering in the hundreds of thousands.
Do you think this will be the end of the invasion? They still have a navy.
But I'd say they've lost too many men to continue.
Bion pulled off his helmet and went to the river to sluice his face with water. It helped a little. Not much.
He waded in and submerged himself completely, then pulled himself out and shook off the worst of the water.
The droplets ran pink with Persian blood.
Hermes was still there.
Bion asked, "Are you supposed to take me to Zeus?" "My duties are here."
Hermes gestured to the Greeks who were gathering their dead for burial.
"But yes, you should go see him. Just imagine where you want to be, and will yourself there." Bion thought of Olympus and closed his eyes. Nothing happened for a moment. Then he thought of what he had done today, scything down dozens of lives.
This small thing should be within his power. The world lurched. When he opened his eyes, he was standing in the palace of the gods. It seemed less intimidating now, or perhaps he was still numb. The pantheon was seated before him, and they were all looking upon him with approval.
Even Zeus was smiling. "Greetings, Bion."
"A fine triumph," he said.
"The Persians are routed and Greece will be safe."
"Given who your father is, perhaps it's not so surprising that you deal out death so well."
But his father was the only god who didn't meddle in mortals' lives.
Bion was beginning to understand Hades' position, although he wasn't about to say so aloud.
"If you want something from Zeus, make him happy with you." Bion took a breath. "If I've pleased you, I have a favor to ask, Nut." Zeus's expression turned wary. "What?" "Eternal youth for a woman."
Zeus's brows went up as he leaned back on his throne.
"And why does she deserve this?" Anyone who knew Myrrine wouldn't need to ask. He floundered.
"Charon raised her.
I love her. With these links to the gods, isn't it only fitting she share our lifespan?"
"She has no more such links than many other mortals with divine blood and suitors."
"Wasn't your mother looking for a more appropriate bride?" Bion never wanted to hear about that nymph again.
"Even if I didn't desire Myrrine as my wife, I'd want her in my life. She's my dearest friend. I wouldn't have survived growing up in the underworld without her." He thought he wanted the fullness of his powers and freedom from the underworld, believing these things would make others see him as a grown man. But they didn't matter, not compared to the way Myrrine looked at him, with acceptance and tenderness and joy.
He never wanted to lose that. A mortal raised in the underworld, Zeus stroked his beard.
"As long as she remains there, I see no reason why she must suffer death." Next to him, his wife Myrrine nodded.
"That seems fair."
"She's not living her life, so she needn't reach the end of it."
Appalled, Bion fell back a step. "You would trap her in the underworld?"
She'd only just begun to explore the sunlit lands.
Hera's lips thinned. She's as free to live her life as any other mortal.
Or she can stay in the underworld of her own choice.
If you want to talk about traps, look to your father and what he did to Persephone.
It was because of his mother that he knew how perilous a restriction this could be. He appealed to Zeus again.
I won the battle. He hadn't realized his victory would prove so thin a coin.
You got the chance because of the mess you helped bring about in the first place, Zeus pointed out.
Was he always going to be blamed for that? The Yazatas didn't even know I was there. They objected to the dead men, and I didn't bring them out of the underworld.
But you could have stopped them.
He could have, but it might have cost him Myrrine.
He set his jaw.
Fine. Myrrine won't age or die as long as she stays down there.
Zeus scowled. You should learn to accept gifts more graciously. But I'll abide by my word.
So be it.
Bion had once dreamed about living with the other gods on Olympus. Seeing them all nod as though Zeus had actually made a fair pronouncement made him never want to see them again. He willed himself away to Myrrine, wondering what he'd tell her.
Chapter 7. Myrrine watched the circling vultures because she couldn't look at the battlefield any longer.
She had watched every moment of Bion's rampage through the Persian army, unable to look away, shocked by his ruthless efficiency in cleaving down any Persian who came near him.
He'd been a whirlwind of death.
Hermes, standing beside her, had cheered him on. She'd kept quiet, trying to force down her nausea as she witnessed so much blood and torn flesh. Ferried soldiers had spoken only of the glory of war. Then Bion had pulled that Persian general off his horse, and the battle had shifted dramatically. She hoped this meant the war was won. She wasn't sure she could bear more fighting. Hermes had gone to tend to the dead and she pulled her cloak more tightly around herself, feeling cold and alone. When Bion appeared beside her, she threw her arms around him, wanting nothing more than to feel another living being.
You were watching?
He asked.
Yes. I saw you.
You were incredible.
I've never seen anyone move so quickly.
It was no fairer to set me upon the Persians than it was to bring the Manticore. They had no chance against a god. His tone was so detached she started to draw away from him. He caught her hands and pulled them behind his back so that he stood in her embrace. Just stay. Please. She hugged him tightly. It took a long time for his body to relax into hers. I thought I'd relish battle, he said, still somber, but at least he no longer sounded so remote. But it was just a slaughter. Not as glorious as we'd thought. His laugh was bitter.
No. I'd do it all again, though.
You helped save Greece.
I was mostly worried about you.
I'm glad you're safe.
Between you and Aristodemos, yes.
She hoped the Spartans had seen his brave charge and would accord him proper honors.
He finally let her go. Where do you want to go now?
She took a deep breath.
Aristodemos told me where my birth parents are. I want to meet them.
Some emotion she couldn't make out shadowed Bion's eyes for a moment. But he said readily enough, I'll go with you. It's a long walk, she warned him.
Not when you travel with a god.
She was glad to see a glimmer of humor return to his face. How does this work?
Where are we headed?
She told him and he nodded.
Give me a moment.
He closed his eyes in concentration, then reached for her hand. She gave it to him and he pulled her close against him. Between one breath and the next, the air changed, warmer, fragrant with growing things. Stalks of barley were crushed under her sandals. She looked around the field as crickets chirped away, undisturbed by their sudden appearance. It's beautiful, she said. She thought that cities and battles, crowded and exhilarating, would be the best part of the sunlit realms, but this quiet corner of the world spoke to her with far greater power.
Bion didn't answer for a moment. It is. It would suit you.
She paid him for the flattery with a kiss. Her parents' home was a humble dwelling, only a small log hut, but it seemed utterly at peace, untouched by the war or any other troubles. Even so, the couple who lived inside had apparently felt so bereft they'd sent a soldier into the underworld for her. Bion squeezed her hand. I'll wait out here, Dot.
She nodded and walked inside. A middle-aged woman stood before a loom, weaving.
She turned at the sound of the door opening and her lips parted in shock. Myrrine had seen her reflection in the sticks change as she grew older, and she wouldn't be surprised if the rippling surface showed her this woman's face in 15 years. She wished she'd asked Aristodemos her parents' names.
Mother? The woman stepped forward and enfolded her in an uncomfortably tight embrace. My daughter.
Her voice broke, she was weeping.
You're returned to me at last.
Aristodemos found me, but he died before he could bring me himself. As long as you're here in Hale.
She stiffened.
At one point she disliked Aristodemos, but now she felt offended that his death, crazed, messy, noble, merited no acknowledgement at all. Her mother pulled back to arm's length, studying her.
What did he call you? Myrrine.
Her mother made a moue, no doubt she'd planned to give a different name.
At least you've turned out well enough. Your father's out in the fields. Let me call him. No, not yet. One birth parent was enough to take in.
Myrrine gestured to a pair of stools.
Can we talk a little while, just us?
Of course.
They sat down.
Her mother reached out to stroke her hair, and Myrrine kept herself from flinching, so few people had ever touched her.
You must have questions. What do you want to know? How did you get out of the underworld? She'd wondered ever since Sharon first told her about her birth parents.
Her mother took her hand with a tearful smile.
It was you. I was pregnant with you when I went to fetch your father back from there.
I knew they would never let an unborn child be consigned to the underworld. So before I went, I beseeched Hephaestus to craft an unbreakable chain, and used it to bind your father's shade to me. Even so, it took too much time to win his freedom, and you were born before we made it completely back to the land of the living. If anyone could create such a chain, it would be the smith of the gods.
But if it's unbreakable?
Her mother raised her right hand. The wrist bore a metal bracelet. If Myrrine squinted, she could see the fine chain attached to it, stretching out past the doorway. Unbreakable, yes, but not unmoldable, her mother said. After we returned, Hephaestus thinned the chain and made it longer. We must stay near each other, but we're allowed some distance. That's quite a commitment, Myrrine observed.
I love him. And he was taken from me too soon. Myrrine imagined wearing such a chain with Bion.
It wasn't such an unbearable thought. She imagined tugging on the chain, letting him know she wanted him even when he was out of sight, knowing she could always follow its length to find him.
Why did Hephaestus do these things for you? She asked. He's my father. Your grandfather. So in a convoluted sense, she was related to Sharon.
The thought relieved her more than she could say. It's best not to speak too freely of it, her mother added.
It doesn't please Aphrodite. Illegitimate children were common among the gods. Who was my grandmother, then? A blacksmith's daughter.
You can see how she gained Hephaestus's attention.
And my father? He's fully mortal. He came from a long line of farmers. This land has been in his family for generations.
She hadn't known anything about her parents, but all the other living interlopers in the underworld had been heroes, kings, musicians of mythic renown. The last thing she'd expected was a barley farmer's wife. But courage wasn't reserved for warriors.
And you came back here after venturing into the underworld.
Where else? This is where we wanted to raise our children.
We've been happy here.
The door slammed open. A boy ran inside and stopped in his tracks when he caught sight of Myrrine. His eyes, wide with surprise, were a familiar shade. Her mother beckoned him forward. Zopyros, this is your sister Myrrine.
From the underworld?
Zopyros asked, taking a few steps closer. He was her brother. Raising children here hadn't been just a dream for her parents. The realization freed her somehow.
Yes, Myrrine said. He eyed her with frank curiosity. What's it like? She considered, wanting to give him an honest answer.
The words might have come easily only a short time ago, but they would have been different words.
She said, not always a place to escape from.
Her mother understood what she meant. A distressed expression crossed her face.
Don't you want to meet your father?
She asked as Myrrine rose. My father is Sharon, Myrrine said. She didn't need any more pieces of a past that she'd never stitch into her present life. Her mother stiffened, so she softened the blow as best she could. Farewell, mother. As she passed her brother, she ruffled his hair. And to you, Zopyros. She went through the doorway and closed the door behind her.
Bion was waiting outside, facing away.
His shoulders were tense, so she went to stand behind him and smoothed them with her hands.
Are you going to stay with them?
His voice was gruff. She circled her arms around his waist and hooked her chin over his shoulder.
No. His entire body loosened with his next exhalation.
She stayed tucked against him, loving how they needed no words for her to know how much he cared for her. The tautness of his muscles and the rhythm of his breath told her everything.
My mother was there.
I talked with her a little, just things I was curious about. He let his head lean against hers. So how did she get your father out of the underworld?
She grinned.
Of course it was the first thing both the ferryman's daughter and Hades' son wondered. Hephaestus helped her because she's his daughter.
You're of divine descent.
He pulled out of her embrace to spin around.
Full-blooded?
She frowned, puzzled.
No. Does that change things? It doesn't change how I feel about you.
But I was hoping, he swallowed.
Gods are immortal.
Bion was a god, and thus immortal, she, on the other hand.
Oh, Bion.
She hugged him.
He jerked back. Don't try to comfort me. We're talking about your own death. It doesn't bother me. I've seen what awaits me, and knowing gives me some peace. But it'll hurt you. Hurt me, he repeated in disbelief.
He caught her face between his hands and kissed her so she could taste his desperation. His teeth raked over her lower lip before he delved into her mouth and did his best to make her dissolve into him. She understood now how a kiss might make someone swoon. When they broke apart, breathing hard, he said, "What if I petition Zeus to make you immortal?"
She wrinkled her nose. Would I have to live on Olympus?
Nonplussed, he said, "Does that matter to you, where you would live?"
Yes.
Certainly not among gods who cared not one whit for her without Bion's sanction. And although the sunlit realms were riotous with color and excitement, and she'd never regret having seen them, she'd also witnessed terrible things here. In the underworld, justice was meted out. Hades and Persephone weren't the most peaceful of rulers, but they kept their conflict between themselves. And she could live a million lives through the stories of her father's passengers. It occurred to her that she didn't know where Bion wanted to live. She swallowed. She wanted to be with him, but she didn't want to force him somewhere against his preference. She would see where he wanted to stay and follow him there, but there was somewhere she wanted to go first.
She touched his arm. Can you take me back to the underworld? I should let my father know I'm all right. This time we will have to walk, he said. But only through the tunnels.
He knelt and slammed his fist into the ground. The earth broke open and she gasped as the soil crumbled away beneath her feet. Bion caught her when she would have fallen into the chasm and leapt down, landing smoothly at the bottom on the cavern floor. "These godly powers are useful," she said lightly as he helped her stand on her own.
Yes. He glanced at her, then away. Come on.
They began walking into the darkness, hand in hand. "You should see your father, too," she said.
I will.
They walked on until Myrrine, listening, thought she could hear the waters of the Styx. She pulled her fingers free from Bion's and ran the last stretch of distance into Charon's arms.
Chapter 8.
The palace was quiet with a familiar icy anger.
Bion wished armor could protect him from his father's disapproval as well as it did arrows. Greetings, father. Hades was in a foul temper. First my wife, then my son. Am I to have no family left? You could have brought me back.
Now that he'd come into his powers, he knew precisely how it could be done.
That's what I did once with your mother, and I'm still paying for it. It was always about Persephone. So why don't you go after her?
His father gave him a baleful look.
And leave the underworld without a ruler? Bion threw up his hands. I'll keep watch over the dead.
You've already let 300 of them out. He had hoped his father had forgotten about that.
Beginner's luck? Hades snorted and turned away. Apparently this was to be the extent of his homecoming. He was tired of his parents' strife overshadowing everything in his life.
Go to her, father.
You've always made her come to you. You should be the supplicant for once.
His father's steps slowed, then came to a stop.
Do you think for a moment she would welcome me?
The sunlit realms are her solace away from me. If you truly believe she needs a refuge from you, then you should let her go. Not just for part of the year.
For good.
Hades turned back to him, making a harsh sound of denial.
Bion pressed on.
If you think there's even the slightest chance she might find happiness with you, brooding here in your misery isn't going to bring it about. He only knew that if he ever drove Myrrine away from him, he would do anything to win her back. Hades closed his eyes as though faced with a sight he couldn't bear. When he opened them he said sternly, "If you lose even a single shade." "Father, trust me." His father was gone before he finished speaking.
Bion needed to practice that.
He went to the throne room and looked at his father's seat, then at the empty throne next to it that was his mother's. Promising to step in as Lord of the Underworld had been an impulsive move on his part, a way to induce his father to leave.
If it helped his parents find peace, he couldn't regret it. Even if Myrrine chose to go back to the sunlit realms and he couldn't follow.
If he told her the price.
No.
She'd already told him once that death held no dread for her. And he refused to sway her one way if she decided her happiness lay elsewhere.
He went to the riverbank.
Myrrine was waiting for him in Karen's boat with a smile curving her lips. He knew her skin was smoother than riverstones, he imagined it growing wrinkled. Her mouth was a surer blaze starter than flint, but someday the warm breath would leave those lips for the last time. He ached with the knowledge of her mortality. But what mattered most was that smile. "I'm the lord of this realm," he told Sharon. "And I say that she can go freely from here." "She was always free to go," the ferryman said.
Myrrine looked at Bayan earnestly. "I don't want to leave."
Bayan said, "You don't what?"
"I want to stay here."
Joy unfolded in him and he caught her in his arms.
He couldn't stop grinning. "I thought you wanted to go back to the sunlit realms. You really don't mind staying in the underworld?" "I grew up here."
She ran her fingers over the water-worn sheen of Karen's boat.
"It's home.
And as long as you're here, you'll stay young."
"You made me immortal? Do you mind?"
She kissed him warmly.
"Not if it means I get to be with you."
If not for Karen's presence, he would have pulled her in for a much longer kiss.
"I'll be here as long as you are." She gave him a quizzical look.
"Did you just say that you're the lord of the underworld?" "Father had to go see to something in the land of the living. He left me to rule in his absence."
He coughed. "The palace is all mine now.
With a proper bed." Her expression grew speculative.
"Father, I'll be back." Sharon gave Bayan a flat look.
"You'll marry her, Dot." He'd always felt that the ferryman had never quite approved of him. But he lifted his chin and met Karen's gaze.
"Yes, for as long as she'll have me."
Sharon grunted, then handed Myrrine a key.
"Your dowry. Hades kept the chest for me in the palace."
He kissed her forehead.
"I love you."
He pushed the boat into the sticks as she stared after him.
Bayan claimed Myrrine's hand and tugged her gently toward the palace.
She came with him willingly enough, but she kept glancing back at Sharon. He kissed the furrow between her brows.
"What is it?"
"I was just thinking that perhaps my father might someday want a rest from his duties as well. It might be nice to be able to greet some of the Spartan soldiers when they arrive."
"A ferrywoman for the Styx?"
He smiled at the thought.
"Why not? As long as you take frequent breaks to spend with me."
She gave him a sidelong look. Her eyes were bright with amusement. "I'm not so sure these breaks would be restful, exactly, but
they'll be invigorating."
"Here, let me show you." He leaned over and lost himself in the sweetness of her lips. They kissed the whole rest of the way to the palace, but when he tried to steer her toward the bedroom, she halted.
"Wait, I want to see what my father gave us."
"Where would this chest be?" "The treasure room, I suppose." His father owned all the riches of the earth, but he did keep some special pieces safely stored away.
"This way."
They found the chest easily enough. Unlike all the others in the room, which were painted with elaborate friezes, this one was plain.
Myrrine unlocked it with the key and opened it.
A bright spill of drachmas poured over her hands, a king's ransom several times over. Bayan said, astounded, "These must be the fares of every passenger he's taken across the Styx since you were born. Carefully saved for her so that she might marry any man who won her regard."
She laughed. "Not that you can spend it in the underworld."
He pulled her to him.
"I have all that I need." Epilogue.
Hades found his wife in the shade of an orchard, fingering small green swells of unripe fruit. There was something unutterably graceful about her lifted arm, and it stopped him in his tracks. She was so beautiful it stole his senses.
That was the trouble, wasn't it?
He'd seen her beauty and thought of nothing but possessing it, even at the price of her joy. Even today, knowing what he'd done to her, he couldn't stay away. He stepped forward. She heard him and turned. He halted again and she stared at him, her expression distinctly cool. She pressed her lips together as she refused to give him the greeting any wife should give her husband. They'd spent so long in this frosty silence. He was tired of it. He removed his cloak and knelt to lay it at her feet. Then, gently so that they wouldn't be bruised, he spread out a bounty of fruit upon the cloak, figs and apricots and mulberries.
And an early pomegranate.
"These were all born of living trees," he said.
"Eating them will oblige you to nothing."
She didn't even glance at the fruit, her gaze was locked on him.
"Why are you here?" "Because if I'm not in the underworld, you don't have to be either."
Her eyes widened.
"How long are you staying up here?" "Someone must rule the dead or there'll be chaos." "Bayan sits upon my throne."
He stood and took her hands. She might have become the queen of the underworld only reluctantly, but she'd come to care about her responsibilities to the realm. Perhaps that wasn't all that could change. "Our son was born 9 months after you willingly came to my bed."
It had been the sweetest night of his life. It gave me hope. She sighed, and all the brittleness left her with that breath. She consented to be brought against his chest so she might lay her head upon his shoulder. I don't hate you anymore, or even the underworld. But you never gave me a choice. I know. I'm sorry, Dot. Her voice was so quiet he could barely make it out. I've waited a long time to hear that. I had too much pride. And fear that, for apology, you'd demand I let you go. And if I did? I'd want to start over and court you properly. She lifted her head. A smile was in her eyes for the first time he could remember. Thus the fruit? Thus the fruit. I gave you all the gold and jewels you could dream of, but in the underworld I could never offer you anything living. She stepped away from him and reached into the nearest tree. Her mother was the goddess of the harvest, a plum ripened into her hand. She brought it to him and held it against his lips. Would you eat it if it bound you to me as much as I am to you? He bit into its sweetness. Juice ran down his chin. That won't do, she said gravely, although her eyes were dancing now. She leaned over and began to lick her way along his jawline. Persephone. Hush. She found his mouth. They didn't say anything as sunlight and hands fell upon skin long untouched by either, but for once the silence between them was warm. About the author. Carolyn Lee likes to wander across the border of fantasy and romance in her writing. Forays into history and mythology count for bonus points. Ancient battles are iffier, but then again she grew up hearing critiques of how her school's mascot, a knight, was wearing the wrong period armor, and she once dated a guy who owned an honest-to-goodness sword, so maybe it was inevitable. Her own most expert weapon is the foam dart. You can find more of her work online at carolynnlee.com.